Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. We are looking at two poems by Robert Frost. Robert Frost is a well-known American poet. Remember, not a British poet, but an American poet who wrote in the English language. For a long time, they were just imitating the British poets, and we generally believe that it is only with Walt Whitman that a new idiom, the American idiom, came into being. He wrote about literature of nature, and we have to remember that the other great poets were Emerson, Thoreau, Dickinson, Eliot, Pound, etc. Robert Lee Frost, 1874 to 1963. He was a full-time writer, a playwright, and also did some teaching. He lived in rural America and believed that he has to write about the region in which he lived. Many poems of his have been favorites. Even of our great leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru loved that poem which ends with, "And miles I have to go before I sleep." Remember newly independent India. Look at his other poems like Apple Picking, his poems about whether walls are built to people in or to keep people out, inclusion or exclusion. A great poet with a philosophy of life. Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. Seems as if we're talking about two contradictory things. And why not? Because that's what Frost tells us in this poem. He says, some people believe that the world would end in fire, some say in ice. Will the world burn itself out, or will it get frozen? Two theories. But to him, fire and ice signify much, much more. He's talking about the self-destructing human tendencies. And therefore, ice stands for insensitivity, hatred, coldness. And fire stands for greed and desire. And when he looks at both these, fire and ice, and what they stand for, he says, I think it's more likely that the world would end in fire. Okay, let's imagine we have two options. So he says, but if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great. The whole poem is written in a very, very satirical tone. It's not nature which is going to bring an end to this world, but man himself with all his flaws and his vices. A very, very short poem, but how much it conveys to us, you cannot dispute that. The rhyme scheme, if you notice, is fire, ice, desire, fire twice. There are a number of figures of speech that he has even in the short poem. You have enjambment, maybe you've heard that earlier, where the sound does not end with the end of a line, but it goes on to make sense even in the next line. I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great. So look at how the lines go on into the next line. Here is a figure of speech which is not very common, and maybe some of you are hearing it for the first time, and that is anaphora, which is the repetition of the same word at the beginning of consecutive lines. So if you look at the beginning of the poem, some say the world, and the second line begins with some say in ice. So you have the repetition. The second poem of Robert Frost that we are now looking at is a poem called Dust of Snow. He seems to be specializing in short poems. or I have chosen his short poems. Because this poem again is only 8 lines. And what is it? Dust of snow. Dust. Can snow have dust? But remember, we are talking about the lightness of the flake as it falls on us. Maybe most of us have not experienced snowfall, but all of us have experienced a drizzle. So let's imagine that it is the softly pattering rain on you. But here, of course, it is the dust of snow. So how does the poem begin? The way a crow shook down on me the dust of snow from a hemlock tree. The first 4 lines of the poem is telling us a lot. What is he telling us? He was walking by, the poet, the persona, walking under a tree, and suddenly he found something falling on him. He probably looked up, and what did he see? He saw that a crow was sitting there, was probably shaking the branches, or probably even shaking itself, because the snow had fallen on it. And he finds that snow, the soft flakes of snow, which he refers to as dust of snow, is falling on him. And what is the tree? The tree is a hemlock tree. We need to read the verse again. Just 4 lines. Seemingly simple, but not so simple. Because I think each word is chosen after deliberating about the symbolism that is associated with the word. When you think of birds, what birds come to mind? Ever so many, depending on which part of the world, which part of our country you live in. But he thinks of the crow, because remember, very often in many of our cultures, the crow is considered a symbol of doom, a symbol of ill omen. And then look at it. He talks about dust. Why not the flakes of snow? Why dust? Because dust, remember, oh, the dust got into my eye. Oh, my room is dirty because there's too much of dust. Dust always somehow seems to suggest some kind of trouble coming in. And then trees. What trees can you think of? Of course, I'm looking at it in the Indian context, but we must remember they are not Indian trees, and therefore you can't talk of the mango tree or the peepal tree or the neem tree or whatever. You have to look at it in the American context. And therefore, the tree that he chooses is hemlock. Maybe not many of you have heard of hemlock, but if you remember Socrates, when he was given the cup of hemlock by the leaders of the state then. And what is hemlock? It was poisonous. The leaders wanted Socrates to die. And Socrates happily did drink of the cup of hemlock. But I'm not talking to you about Socrates. I'm talking to you about what hemlock means when Frost uses it here. So something leading to doom, leading to death. But to the poet, this is something which changes his mood. Maybe he was in a bad mood, but now his mood changes. And he says, he starts looking optimistically at the day ahead. A simple poem, read it again for the meaning. But what about the figures of speech? Even as I was describing the meaning to you, I've already talked about one figure of speech, which is symbolism. I've told you about what the crow stands for, what dust stands for, what hemlock stands for. And of course, there is metaphor, which I'm not going to describe to you again. And then you have alliteration, the sound, and then you have synecdoche. Again, synecdoche and metonymy are slightly difficult to understand. But you remember, in synecdoche, a part for the whole. And when he says, my heart has got a change of mood in the beginning of the second stanza, it's not just his heart, it is him as a person, and therefore it is synecdoche. 2 short poems by Robert Frost. I'm sure all of you are intrigued about the poet. And yes, go on and read his poems. Wonderful poems that can take you to another world, the world of the rural countryside of the US. Happy reading. The way a crow shook down on me the dust of snow from a hemlock tree has given my heart a change of mood
and saved some part of a day I had rued.